From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 308, recorded live Thursday, March 1st, 2012. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. In this episode, Scott talks with Corey Haines about pairing with other developers and software craftsmanship.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and I am talking today with software journeyman Corey Haines. How are you, sir?
Good, excellent. How are you, Scott?
I am very well. So I wanted to talk to you because of a couple of things. You call yourself the software journeyman, and I just love that because craftsmanship is a word that I personally use all the time to refer to what I think has kind of been lost in software. The idea that we don't have this apprenticeship, journeyman, master kind of process. I feel sometimes like it's harder to become a plumber or a certified electrician than it is to become a software developer.
Yeah, it's pretty much if you can type into a computer, you have the rights to say you're a software developer.
Is that okay? I mean, should it be harder? Should people put the kind of effort that you're putting into this and that you encourage people to put into their craft?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure how to go about doing it, but it does make sense, especially as software becomes so prevalent in our lives, and it's in pretty much everything. It's in our cars, it's in the medical devices, it's in planes. The quality of code that we generally see when we go around, that both we write and everybody writes, it's frightening if you think about it in terms of this is running our lives and this is saving our lives. And, if a pacemaker goes under, what's going to happen?
Well, I hope that people who work for the pacemaker company, or myself as someone with an insulin pump that has never had its software crash, I hope that the people who are writing that kind of software have some qualifications, but other than things like ACM and IEEE and different organizations, there's really no way to know, other than looking at someone's resume, whether or not they've gone through that process. They've really honed their craft.
Yeah, and it's difficult, and we've had a couple sort of starts at it of people talk about having it be sort of very reference-based or trust-based, or, a couple of websites have popped up before of, I vouch for this person. But it's very difficult. They get gamed very easily, and people they tend to only be looked at by developers. And that's more difficult to get it out into the world so people can understand, how do you hire a software developer? How do you gauge what their skill level is? And it's something that, is in active conversation right now, but we stay away so much from the idea of an external certification board because it's difficult to say, like in electricity, there's some fundamentals that most everybody agree upon, but in software, we're at the stage where there's still discussion about certain fundamentals that, I think shouldn't be argued anymore, but we still argue about them and we still discuss them. So it's hard to say, here's an external certification board when you can't even agree amongst yourselves what are the fundamentals of development.
I wonder if there's been books on software architecture that have drawn long and extended analogies with software design, with building design, and they do. I've read a couple of books. I forgot the name of the one, but it's basically 150 pages, 200 pages, drawing direct correlation between software construction and actual construction. I think that buildings, and how do you put up a building and these kinds of things, how do you put up a building without it collapsing, are pretty well understood. Is that because we've got 2,000 years of practice, and with software, we've really only got maybe 50 to 100 years?
Yeah, I think so. And we also have a problem of not carrying on knowledge from generation to generation. So we have a tendency for people to come into it without a good introduction, a good way of learning from the people that came before us. And in software, it's similar to like bridge building or something like that, except for the fact that the actual construction phase is pretty much instantaneous. So you can the actual going out and physically constructing the bridge is like a compiler. And we can do that over and over again. So if you think about how you would go about building a house, if you could rebuild it physically every morning, you would most likely go into a very iterative development cycle, because you could change the blueprint, click a button, and suddenly you have another room. And if you don't like that room, you change the blueprint, and it's like, oh, now I have this different room, now that my bedroom's on the second floor. And we don't have a really great sense of how to adjust to that. Glenn Vanderberg has a great talk that he gave, I think last year, at a couple places, called Real Software Engineering, where he took apart sort of what engineering is, took apart what software development looks like, and kind of put it back together and said, there are analogies, but it really is a different type of thing from most physical engineering disciplines. And it's a fantastic speech.
It gets me thinking about layers of abstraction. Like, I think, I'm not a hardware person, but I pretty much understand that the folks that are making silicon right now pretty much understand how it should be done. And as you start moving up the stack, machine language and assembly language and C and all these kind of things, the higher up you get, the more likely we are to disagree about stuff. But at the certain fundamentals we agree upon. I find it kind of interesting that Intel and AMD and all the different folks that make processors mostly agree on how to do hardware design and VLSI, but we up at the top here, kind of floating above standing on the shoulders of giants, can't agree how to do a proper CRUD implementation. That just seems so ironic.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot because of the fact that we don't really kind of learn from the stuff that's gone before. So I think it was Jason Gorman put out on Twitter the other day that he's sad that he reads all of these papers from the early 70s and spends all of his time shaking his head saying, yes, that's how it should be done. And we're just now rediscovering these principles. We keep discovering them. We keep going through these things rather than really just stopping and saying, what is it that we were discovered before? My favorite paper is Parnas's paper on the deconstruction of modules, or the decomposition of modules. And he goes in and talks about decomposing systems based on task versus layer. And they find that a layered system is a much more effective way for obtaining both incidental reuse and intentional reuse than building up what we would consider like an object graph based on responsibility. And it's back in the 70s that he wrote this paper.
I'm looking at Jason Gorman's Twitter feed, and he has a wonderful retweet from R. Tyler Croy, who says, let's all argue about whether Haskell or Clojure is better while someone else ships a product with PHP and duct tape.
Yeah. I saw that. The one thing that I find important about those sorts of comparisons, though, is that there is an important aspect of more of academic discussions that eventually lead into the more production-oriented things. Like I use almost exclusively Ruby on Rails for my web application development because it is so incredibly productive for me. And there's a lot of issues with it. There's a lot of problems with it. And, last year I was giving some talks on sort of extracting out your actual business code from the Rails framework itself. But it's still so incredibly productive to use. But it's important to have those sort of very theoretical discussions about design and about languages, because those are the things that eventually come into real production work. And we start to get a better understanding of how to best apply it. And the idea of getting something into production very, very quickly is one thing, but I've seen several companies that have significant problems, startups, because their code base is so not malleable. It's so rigid and you can't go in and fix issues. You can't go in there and move at the pace that businesses really do need to move at. And we hear a lot about companies that succeed despite their messy code bases. But I do advising technical advising for non-technical founders of startups, and we see time and again the effect that a bad code base can have. And I think that the academic discussions about design and languages do influence how we work in our actual, like, productive production languages. Not that those languages aren't productive. I know people doing great stuff in Clojure and that area.
Well, but even to talk about something like Haskell or Clojure is immediately kind of excluding the available pool of talent down to like the top 1 or 2%. And then I think you start getting into discussions about kind of like the software haves and have-nots. You know, like the pragmatist versus the purist, or the academic versus the non-academic arguments are interesting. But it also brings up the question that, is it possible for us to kind of raise the discourse and raise the discussion around software development when maybe the talent pool is just still interested in slapping this stuff together? I mean, I wrote a blog post a while back called a 501 developer. And this is the developer who's like, hey man, it's 501. Can I punch out? And it wasn't meant to imply that people should work long hours, but it was more about the attitude of like, hey, I gotta get out of here. I got a soccer thing later, Can we just compile this and ship it?
Yeah, I call those accounting developers, because we tend not to go into the accounting department and deride the accountants for not going home and doing accounting. And it's like,
that's good.
There's a valid place for people who do software development as a job, as a skilled job. It's not their passion. It's not their hobby. And, there's a place for it. There's a place where that is not appropriate. Like, I think that small businesses that need to move very quickly, that's not an appropriate place for that mentality. But in companies where the software is not the main thing that's driving their business, there's, my last big job was, there were tons of people. There were, I think a couple thousand developers, and there were a lot of people there who came in. They did their job. They didn't write the greatest of code. There's times when it caused problems, but it got done, and it worked for the most part. And they had processes in place to make sure that really, really bad stuff didn't make it into production. I mean, stuff that made it into production more or less worked. And so there were processes in place to take advantage of the masses of people who do have that attitude. And while it's not the most effective and it's not the most efficient, there is a level of effectiveness there. And I think it's worth treating that as as valuable. And then I think there is a place for the discussions, the very highly theoretical discussions, or discussions of, we are going to be so incredibly fast and productive in the long run. So we're going to build systems in such a way that over the course of the years, they don't calcify. We can still add features very easily. And those places might be considered exclusionary to the other type of developer, but that's okay as long as it's not considered this is the best way or this is the only way to do it. I generally tell people that I consider there to be several software industries, and they each have their different focuses and they each have their different value that they provide to places. And you just have to find the one that suits you best. Large scale corporate work was not, I did it for quite a while, but after a while I realized it wasn't the place for me.
And when you did that, when you decided that wasn't for you, as I understand it, you kind of went on walkabout. You just said, all right, I'm leaving. I'm going to go and learn about software the way that feeds my spirit. What did you do?
Yeah, so when I left the corporate job, I started at a small startup for about 7 months. That wasn't a cultural fit for me, so I actually ended up getting fired from there. And then spent 9 months traveling around, working with people in exchange for room and board. And so I traveled around basically in the Midwest region, and then did a long trip from Cleveland to Miami to Prince Edward Island back to Cleveland, where I was living at the time. And and I would spend anywhere from a day to 5 days with a developer, a freelancer, sometimes with small companies, and learn what they were doing, teach what I was doing, and just sort of share, level, figure out what my level was, increase my level by having to teach stuff. And it was a lot of fun.
How do you coordinate something like that? I mean, there is kind of the one could dismiss that as kind of a strange hippie couch surfing adventure, but you were actually reaching out to people that you wanted to meet, as well as maybe reaching out to people who you did not know already. How do you convince them that you're not just some weirdo and you legitimately have a reason to hang out with them and talk?
Yeah, I think it was like a lot of the coordination was over Twitter, because once it got word out that I was doing this, people started contacting me, asking me to come in there. I started off with a couple people that I knew, and had driven to Chicago and spent about a week with people, and then another week with some people that I knew. So they knew me, they trusted me. It wasn't so weird there. And I think one of the major things that got the word out was that I started doing video interviews with the people that I stayed with. And so I think that got it out there. People saw me, people heard me talking to people. And then over time, it just sort of it didn't sound so strange anymore to have somebody doing this. And people would be like, hey, come in, stay for a day or two. The big thing was when, like, I had one guy have me come in and talk to his wife about it, because they had 2 young girls. And she was like, nervous, who's this weird guy? But it had turned out that I had talked to them and effectively been nice to them at the previous RubyConf. And she was like, oh, it's that guy. Yeah, he can come in. And so I went over there, stayed a night with them, ended up playing guitar with their daughters, playing harmonica. I put a blog post up on it with a video that this was like the highlight of the whole thing. But yeah, it was a lot on Twitter, email. And people just, once somebody's doing that, it's not so strange anymore, I think.
What can someone who's maybe listening learn from that, who can't necessarily kind of like pack it up and then like code and couch surf their way across America?
Well, one of the things that I've talked to people, there's been more and more people who do this type of thing, is if you can't, like you have a family and all of that, is take a day, take 1 day off a week, or take 1 day off and go find a company. Most people have some friends in the community that work at different companies. Say, hey, I'm going to take Friday off. I'd love to come over and pair with you. Or find a regular hack fest that you go to. Like every Tuesday morning here in Chicago, we have a thing called Code and Coffee, and it's 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. at a Starbucks. And we have about 15 to 20 people that come every week, and we just get together and code. And you can get so much value from pairing with people that you don't ordinarily pair with, or that you don't ordinarily talk to. Hear how do they do software development? Because if they're effective and you're effective, and they do it a little bit differently than you, then it's worth looking and seeing, what are they doing? And how can I incorporate some of their best or their better practices into my development methodology as well? Yeah,
it's really powerful, but you have to be a kind of a self-starter to do that. It's funny that you recommend this, because I've recommended this similar thing. I get emails from people who say that, I live in such and such an area and there's not a user group that speaks to me in this area. I feel alone. I feel like I'm doing all this work by myself. And I think to myself, well, I live in a tiny little town in rural Oregon, and I'm pairing with people all the time. You need to get out there. And get out there, it could be pairing over Skype. It could be finding the one other coder in your town and hanging out with them at Starbucks. Or it could be forgetting about a user group and just finding another company that's not in a competitive area and sitting with them and brainstorming. There's such value in that. It's surprising more people don't find that to be the obvious solution.
Yeah, it's one of the things that everything is 20/20 in hindsight. And a lot of times we wonder, how can we get out there? How can we meet people? And then somebody just says, there's Skype. Or there's, go into IRC and ask one of the people that you talk to, hey, you want to, set up a remote pairing session? And most devs are interested in coding with people.
So after you did this trip, then this thing called Code Retreats starts up. Can you help me understand the relationship between your pairing trip and what came out of and what has become this thing called Code Retreats?
Yeah, so during the year 2009, several guys and us at CodeMash had thought up the idea of what could we do to help people practice software development as opposed to the constant learn new frameworks or things. And through the course of 2009, we worked on establishing and sort of evolving this format of a workshop that focused on practicing the fundamentals rather than learning something new per se, because we spend all of our time learning new things, but we forget just the fundamentals of object-oriented design, test-driven development, these sorts of things. And so Code Retreat, over the course of 2009 and roughly 2010, we stabilized onto a really good format that is reproducible. It works. People have a great time. And we do 45-minute sessions through the course of the day. We do about 5 or 6 sessions. And at the end of each 45-minute session, we delete all of the code that we wrote. And we start again. We swap pairs, start again. We work on Conway's Game of Life because it turns out it has an incredibly rich problem domain and design characteristics that you can go in and look at. And so the idea is that by deleting the code, we're not left with the legacy decisions that we had. So we can try new things. We can practice really those core principles. I always introduce the 4 rules of simple design and focus on naming and duplication, and the facilitator then introduces different constraints and exercises each session. And it's been going on for more than 3 years now. They happen almost every weekend somewhere in the world. In December, we had Global Day of Code Retreat, where we ended up with about 94 cities around the globe all doing it on the same day. And plans are roughly in place for doing the second one this year as well.
Wow. Now, is this is a nonprofit, and this is something I could put together in my town?
Absolutely. It's specifically designed so that you don't need one person. You don't need me to be there. We have a site up called coderetreat.org where you can find out information about the format. And all it really takes is about, 6 to 10 people so that you can pair. And there's a set format. There's a recipe for it. So even if you've never done it before, you can follow this recipe. There are ideas for different session constraints. There's a pretty active community. So if you ask questions, a lot of people will answer. And yeah, when we had the 94 cities, most everybody, it was their first time facilitating a code retreat. And we told them everybody was a first time facilitator at some point. And the format itself is designed to be a really great day, even if you don't have a very experienced facilitator. And that I think is the key to having it expand as much as it has over the last 3 years. And we just started a nonprofit out of it that we're hoping to be sort of an umbrella fundraising organization to help fund kids programming events. And so the code retreats I do, they're all free. Every one of the core rules of a code retreat is that it's free to the participants. But we oftentimes will ask for a refundable deposit, and I've started using them as fundraising for this nonprofit to give kids kids programming events stuff. Like we just funded helped sponsor the STEM video game challenge for Black Girls Code, which you had Kimberly on a couple weeks ago.
I did. So the format, you say that it's fairly set. It's set. Is it kind of like an open space in the sense of like when you think about the idea of going to an open space, you think, wow, this is going to be really open and confusing, and it's going to be like really sloppy, but it's actually quite organized, and there's definitely a format, and there's a big difference between a sloppy open space and one that is pretty well organized. This is a code retreat is not just a bunch of guys sitting and coding. That there is structure to it, and even though, like you said, anyone can make this happen, there are certain things that dictate success, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's 45 minutes. We work on Conway's Game of Life. At the end of the 45 minutes, you delete your code, and so it's a very structured day, and it's there's basically about 10 or 15 minute break between them, and the facilitator generally talks and explains some constraints for the next session. So like one session we might do where there's methods have to be less than 3 lines, no if statements, and no primitives passed over method boundaries. And then it's like, okay, go. And one session might be completely tell, don't ask. And it's really this day of working in small 45-minute chunks on a very set problem that, over the past 3 years, we experimented a little bit with different problems, but found Game of Life to be just a beautifully rich problem to experiment on different topics in design. And another rule is there's no pizza.
There's no what?
Pizza. So you get lunch, and it can't be pizza.
I support that 100%. Pizza is, as much as people think pizza is coding fuel, I have found that it is in fact not.
Yeah.
So you've got the speaking thing, you've got the code retreat thing, you do consulting. This is all kind of under the Corey kind of brand, but you're doing so much of this for free.
Yeah, I do. I do in-company trainings as well for to survive and to make money. So I'll go into companies and do. I have an intermediate TDD workshop that I do. I actually go in and do team-based in-house code retreats for companies that are a little more focused towards topics that the team needs to practice, as opposed to the public ones are a little more free in the topics. And I do in-company consulting like that, as well as my girlfriend and I are building some products together. So she's a developer as well. So we do development on side projects that so far are not making a tremendous amount of money, but this year we've got a couple things coming out that we're hoping to build up.
And the coderetreat.org website, you say that there's one going on, they said almost every weekend.
Yeah.
And then are there any specific rules about what you can't do? Like, could you make a code retreat and make it a fundraiser for something at the same time?
Yeah, you can, absolutely. It's as long as it's free for the participants. The surrounding rules of, we're going to raise money. One time I did a code retreat in Bletchley Park, and we ended up raising about, I think, $1,900 for Bletchley Park.
Wow.
It's easy. Anything you want to use it for, something like that. I don't support the idea of the community code retreats paying somebody. Like, I've had my travel expenses covered, but bringing somebody in and paying them, I don't support, but I don't, there are certain things that that I try to be strict about, like the format of it, but things around the edges of it, I'm not a dictator about it. And there's a lot of people who are involved in more kind of leadership roles in the community. And, it's very much a community oriented thing. And coderetreat.org, you can find all of the events listed. There's, usually Like, I think every weekend in March except St. Patrick's Day, there's one going on. But I wouldn't be surprised if somebody throws something together for that. And there's also starting to expand out the family of Code Retreat events. J.B. Rainsberger has put together a format called a Legacy Code Retreat, where the format is still the same as a Code Retreat, but the problem is really focused on working with legacy code. And then Brian Merrick is just putting on, we're going to run the first one on April 7th, a refactoring Code Retreat. So he's put together some exercises around practicing refactoring. And the format will be the same, but the problem and the focus will be a little bit different. So we're slowly expanding out into sort of a family of Code Retreat style events.
That's really clever. I like the idea of specialized ones. I was going to say having one that is like a kata specific to something that is not well understood.
Yeah, and because of the fact that we're very strict on the format of the standard Code Retreat, people ask, can we do a different problem? And our general response is, do Game of Life, because until you've done it, you don't realize that you can spend the whole day working on one problem. And a guy, Aviv in Israel, just wrote a nice blog post about attending his third Code Retreat, and is still amazed that there's so many different ways to approach the problem. And because it has such a set format, it's nice to see people sort of riffing on it, but in a different way, and saying, okay, well, this is Legacy Code Retreat. And that makes it so that when people go to a Code Retreat, they can know pretty clearly what their day is going to look like if they go out and look at the site and see what the format is going to be.
Very cool, very cool. So people can learn about that at coderetreat.org. They can check out your blog. You're easy to find on the web and on Twitter as well.
Yeah, pretty loud. And I'm luckily or happily, if you go to Google and type Corey Haines and click I'm feeling lucky, you get to my blog or my website.
Very, very cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thanks a lot, Scott. It was good talking to you.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.